Lego Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight is one of those games that feels both familiar and surprisingly ambitious at the same time. It is set to release on May 22nd, 2026 on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and PC, with a Nintendo Switch 2 port version coming a bit later. And on paper, it's the fourth main entry in the Lego Batman series, but when you actually look at what they're building here, it feels somewhere closer to a soft reset or at least a significant step forward. Because structurally, this is very different from older Lego Batman games. This time, it's built as a fully open world action adventure experience set in a seamless Gotham City, and that alone changes quite a lot actually. On the surface, it still carries all the classic Lego elements, the humor, the destructible environments, the character switching, all the things that people have come to expect with these sort of titles. But underneath that, it's clearly aiming for something more modern, more fluid movement, more integrated systems, and a stronger focus on how the world connects together. And that becomes even more apparent when you look at the gameplay direction. Combat is no longer just simple button mashing. They're introducing more fluid combos, stealth elements, gadgets, and even detective style mechanics, which is where the Arkham influence becomes pretty clear. It's still adapted to be in the Lego format, so it's not trying to be punishing or too complex. It's much more about the accessibility while still adding depth. And that balance is actually quite important because Lego games have always been about being more approachable. But at the same time, there's been a growing expectation for them to evolve, especially after the Skywalker saga, where they already started pushing toward a more open and system driven design. Now, the Skywalker saga is probably the most prominent game recently that has been released. And while people did like it, or some people even loved it because it is set in the Star Wars universe, many people also voiced their complaints since it was a more open world kind of game. There was a lot of collectibles that you have to do. And while collectibles isn't really a new thing in Lego franchises, it can be quite repetitive when you have to collect an extensive amount of stuff in the games. And some people might have preferred the more linear styles, older games that were more straightforward with the collecting aspect of them. But another big shift here is also the narrative. And this isn't just a collection of missions or retelling existing stories. It's actually an original story that follows Bruce Wayne's journey from his origin all the way to becoming the Dark Knight. And that gives them more creative flexibility because they can pull from different parts of Batman's lore. There's the films, comics, or other games as well, without being tied to one specific version. And at the same time, you've got a wide roster of playable characters. You've got Batman, of course, Robin and Nightwing. You've got Batgirl, Catwoman, Jim Gordon, Tala al Ghul, each with their own abilities, which feeds into how you approach different situations. So again, it's building on the idea of giving players more options, not just in the movement, but in how they interact with the world. And technically, it's also a step up. The game is being built in Unreal Engine 5, which explains a lot of what we've seen visually. More detailed environments, better lighting, and a Gotham that feels more alive, even with the Lego aesthetic. And that's also where it starts to separate itself from older entries. And while Unreal Engine has a lot of positives, it also comes with a lot of negatives because Unreal Engine has come to be known as quite a heavy engine to run games on. It's quite often that you hear games are lacking in their optimization aspects, and people are not surprised by titles that are running on the Unreal Engine that they have come to expect a lower optimization level. This is also the case with Lego Batman. We will take a look at the spec sheet in a moment, but they have recently released this spec sheet and it is worth taking a look at because instead of just being a general statement about performance, it does give a more concrete picture of what the game is aiming for technically. You can see how it scales across different setups and what kind of hardware is needed, what level of performance they're targeting, and how demanding it actually is compared to previous Lego titles. So here we have the spec sheet for Lego Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight, and initially it does look quite good, but once you start looking into it, there's a lot of problems that comes to show. Now we have the minimum requirements, and You need 16 gigabytes of RAM. You have processors, the Intel Core i5 and AMD Ryzen 5, which are pretty decent CPUs. And you've got the graphic cards. It can even run on a GTX 960 and a Radeon RX 6400. What is more interesting is the fact that across the board, from the minimum recommended and 4K, it's all these stats are captured with frame generation enabled and a lot of non-natively running upscalers. And this is where a lot of people have problems with it, because releasing a game and releasing its spec sheet with the fact that it has all these upscalers enabled, people don't see a positive in that. And that is where a lot of the discourse is currently coming from. And we've just recently seen the spec sheet released from Crimson Desert, where all of it was running natively. And you can even run the game on a 1060 graphic card. And then you see this a Lego game that is not on the same level as Crimson Desert in terms of fidelity at all. There are miles apart from each other, and you see a Lego game running with upscalers, and their target FPS is 60 on the recommended. Like, you would expect that a Lego game at this point would be able to run 60 FPS without any upscalers, but this is their target FPS, and it's just insane that this is a standard for them. Because if they're actually cared about hitting 60 FPS natively, they would have optimized their games to run it at that level. But at this point, where they are proudly showing the spec sheet with upscalers, just says a lot about how the studio's standards are, because at this point they're just relying too heavily on the upscalers rather than optimizing the game themselves. But apart from the spec sheet, the early impressions seems to be quite positive. Previews are highlighting aspects of the combat, the scale of Gotham City, and the balance between action and that classic Lego charm that people have come to expect from these titles. And some have even describing it as a Arkham Knight for both kids as well as adults, which honestly captures the intention quite well. But at the same time, there's still some hesitation, not necessarily about whether the game will be fun, but more about how deep it actually goes, because making an open world is one thing, and making it meaningful is something completely different. And that's really where the expectations are. People are excited, especially longtime fans of all the Lego Batman games. There's a lot of nostalgia here. But there's also an understanding that this isn't just about revisiting the past. It's about whether the formula has actually evolved. So, in a way, the game sits in a similar position to some of the others we've talked about. It's not trying to reinvent everything, but it's also not just repeating what worked before. And that success of Legacy of the Dark Knight will probably come down to that balance between accessibility and depth, or between the humor and the tone, between the classic Lego identity and something else that feels more modern. Because if they can manage to get this right, it could easily become the definitive Lego Batman experience. But on the other hand, if it doesn't, it risks feeling like a bigger version of something we've already seen. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, maybe consider subscribing or leaving a comment or a like, as that will really help me out with the algorithm. And I hope to cover this game some more, maybe once they start releasing more marketing material for it, and even after the game is released. I'm looking forward to covering the sentiment in the gaming industry, what players are saying about it, if they feel let down, or if the game manages to knock it out of the park and hit it off with everyone. But yeah, that's gonna do it for me. Take care, everyone.